scaling walls, stealing podiums, and women shot to death in the chest. What happened at our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021? How did a rally turn into a riot and a raid, and what are the implications and limitations of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the freedom to protest? Buckle up, this is an intense episode as we dive into the limitations on your First Amendment rights. Welcome back, everyone, to Hashtag Lawyer. You have your favorite legal A-team, Austin and Andrea here.
Part two of our two-part series.
Part two of our two-part series.
On the storming of the Capitol, as I'm starting to call it.
Storming of the Capitol. I'm still just very surprised that this even happened. Again, like we said last time, the Capitol has not been stormed since the British made it in 1814.
Right.
I don't think this is a good comparison.
No, it's not. And you know, last week we talked about the criminal implications of everything. Yes. Today we're going to talk about the First Amendment, and you and I both like talking about the First Amendment.
Yes,
and there's just a lot you can get into with it.
There is.
But I think this has more real implications to our listeners in everyday life.
Absolutely. I would 100% agree with that. So let's just dive right into it, right? So, Austin, anyone and everyone, even probably my puppy, knows, well, maybe not her, that free speech is protected by the First Amendment. Okay. But you know what? Let's just read the First Amendment for everyone, because I love to go back and read the law. When I'm preparing motions and stuff, I literally go back, even if I know the law, I read it again to make sure I know what I'm talking about. Well,
and that's a teaching point for all, if there's any young law students out there listening. I always tell my employees and my team members, go back and read the law when you're looking at something, because every case is different. You may find something different in that law than you didn't see before because you're looking at it with a different set of facts.
Absolutely. So the First Amendment, I'm going to read to make sure there is no misunderstanding. It's not a long law. The First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. End statute. All right. Now we have our First Amendment.
We do. And today we're going to focus on the speech portion of it.
We are focusing on the freedom of speech and the right of people to peaceably assemble. Yeah. Because I think those are usually pretty similar, and these days they go hand in hand.
Keyword peaceably.
Peaceably,
There's
y'all.
a reason
peaceably.
The Founding Fathers put that in there, and I think we saw that last week.
No one got tarred and feathered this time, but still, let's not do it. So, I think something to start off with is that while there are limitations on the First Amendment, right? You can't do anything and everything, can't say anything and everything. The courts historically have upheld the position that the First Amendment should be broadly construed so as to ensure that the public is provided with the relevant information and education that's needed for the times.
Right.
Okay. So this is really broad. And so the courts are saying, y'all, very, very broad. Basically all ideas, even having the slightest of social importance, including very unorthodox ideas, controversial ideas, even ideas hateful to the prevailing climate of opinion, they all have full protection of the First Amendment. So what's an example? Let's go back to the classic case of Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, where a bunch of Holocaust survivors lived.
Yeah, this is one we were talking about just before we went on air.
We were just talking about this.
It's highly polarizing.
Yeah.
But, to kind of tell listeners kind of what went on with that.
So basically, and I'm going to paraphrase this case, there is this is a Jewish neighborhood, okay? Skokie, Illinois, at the time was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and they had a number of Holocaust survivors. And there were Nazis who said, being terrible, disgusting, awful human beings that they are, sorry, not sorry if that offends you, they wanted to conduct a parade and walk with swastika and other Nazi regalia and symbols through a neighborhood chock full of Holocaust survivors. Right. Disgusting. Anyway, they went through the appropriate municipal procedures to get a parade permit in order to conduct this parade. And at the end of the day, the court ruled that while this was extremely lacking in taste and hateful and I'm paraphrasing, and just awful to those survivors, it was still protected because it was freedom of speech, and the content of that speech, right, that they think Jews were bad, that didn't need to be restricted. That was still protected by the First Amendment, which is shocking to a lot of people.
It is, and the analogy I always put in, that I always talk about, that I mentioned to you before we went on air, is there's been cases before of where flag burning, burning the American flag, has been upheld as a First Amendment free speech protected
it's political
activity.
speech.
Political speech, and it has to be allowed because as long as they're not violating any any municipal, state, federal laws, they're expressing their distaste with the government. They're allowed to do that. And, that may anger us just like the Nazi situation does, but as long as those humans are not making threats, and we'll get into some of this stuff, as long as they're not doing things that they're making threats or actually causing violence, they're allowed to express those views regardless of how unpopular they are. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Our founding fathers came from a situation where the king was suppressing their grievances. They were suppressing their ability to protest, suppressing their ability just to speak about ideas that were considered treason to the crown. So obviously they realized how important this was. And in our society today, looking at it in 2021, it's also part of the way that we develop diversity within our society, about all the different ideas we have. And that can stem anything from racial, ethnic, gender backgrounds, all those types of things. But just the diversity of ideas only comes when people can freely talk about these things within limits.
You can only have a marketplace of ideas if you're actually allowed to communicate those ideas.
Right, absolutely.
So I also want to swing back, right? So we discussed earlier that there are limitations on free speech. So I'm just going to run through and identify what type of speech the First Amendment explicitly does not protect. And when I say explicitly, I mean that there have been numerous Supreme Court and other high court rulings that say these forms of speech are not protected by the First Amendment. Okay, and so those are going to be incitement, right? So that's basically vigorous activity, excuse me, let me rephrase that. That sounded really terrible. Okay. Anyway.
Activity, advocacy, same thing.
I was thinking advocacy, yes. Anyway, so basically vigorous advocacy for a cause is one thing. That's fine. You're wholeheartedly supporting a cause. Saying, let's make it really polarizing. You're a vigorous advocate of being pro-life.
Yeah.
And you say that abortion is murder. Okay, well, you want to peacefully picket and march and hold a parade after getting the appropriate permits, and go around an abortion clinic after getting permits.
Yeah,
that's fine.
You can stand outside with whatever
stand on the street, stand on the sidewalk. That's fine. But the minute you start saying abortion is murder, burn the abortion clinic, let's throw Molotov cocktails at it, that is not protected, because now at this point you are inciting violence.
And if you're in Texas, you may be doing a terroristic threat like we talked about last episode.
There we go. If you want to hear more about terroristic threats, tune in last week. So, and then another activity, excuse me, wow, I don't know why I keep using that word, y'all. Anyway, another form of speech that is not protected is obscenity. Austin, what's obscenity?
Well, it's there's a very detailed legal definition of it, but I think one of my favorite, and I don't remember which justice said this, but said that, I don't necessarily know what's obscene, but I know it when I see it.
Yes, so I think the same justice actually would watch certain adult films in the screening room of the Supreme Court building to determine if these films were obscene and should be not allowed for publication or dissemination.
Right. But obscenity and pornography is one of the biggest things. That's the easiest one.
I think that screening thing happened, by the way. Professor Gwynn told us that, my con law professor. Let me just fact check that, but that's what I was told.
You know what? Sometimes hyperbole is okay. So porn is one of the easiest ones. I mean, that's something that you're not freely allowed to just disseminate that in the public. And it's obviously, there's policy reasons behind these restrictions. Incitement, obviously, having someone incite violence, that's a problem. You shouldn't allow it to happen. Allowing the proliferation of obscene material when you've got minors in the public space.
Yeah, and zero tolerance.
And also that people who can be highly offended, understandably so, by those types of things. That's why we don't allow obscenity just to freely fill the marketplace either.
Absolutely. And so another area of speech that is not protected is defamation. So, I don't remember the episode number, but we did an episode on defamation with the Emily Gillisland and the F Factor diet, and Emily Gillisland making all of these comments and republishing allegations by women about the fact that they allegedly suffered all these medical issues because of the powders from the F Factor company.
Right.
Okay, so that's defamation.
Yeah.
Suppose that was possibly defamation. Let me put it that way. There's been no decision that I know of yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's an idea. It's an example of something that could be charged. I mean, shout out to Dave Wishnu and TJ Jones.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Go back and listen to that episode. They really walk us through that. But the idea of that is you've got an actual false statement of fact, not just an opinion. So it's not just President Trump saying President Biden's a bad person. He's allowed to say that. If he says President Biden is a convicted felon, and that's not true, well, now we have a defamation issue, and that's not protected by First Amendment rights.
And speaking of criminal conduct, speech integral to criminal conduct is also not protected. So what would be an example of that?
Well, so we talked about conspiracy in our last episode. And so having conversations about, okay, we should build this bomb and go plant it at the Capitol building. Well, you can't just say that because that's, I mean, if you said that in public, that would you'd probably be more in the inciting arena. But that's also, if you're in private, that's not free speech. That you're not allowed to say those things because it's incident to a criminal activity that you were planning and well, you've already committed because it's conspiracy.
And I think another very easy example to understand is fraud. So for example, if Joanna is selling jeans on her Etsy shop and she's saying that these are Gucci jeans with her special logo signed onto them. They're Gucci jeans with Kim Kardashian's signature on them. There we go. And then she's selling these jeans through her Etsy shop, and it turns out they're just Old Navy jeans with a Kim Kardashian's name printed on it. Okay, well, now that's fraud because she deceived people into buying these jeans and said that they were something that they weren't.
Right.
Okay, so that speech is not protected.
Right.
And so, now the next one, right? The next one is really big, and we'll go into this in depth in just a moment, but it's the fighting words. So fighting words are not protected.
Still called that.
I do too. It makes me think of like a boxer, you know?
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of like rural towns, kind of, where my family's from, where it's like, hey, them's is fighting words. All right. I like that because it's like you can see that, you can see the emotion coming out of it.
Yes, you can.
And the Supreme Court actually use that definition.
Yes.
Love it.
So we'll go back to fighting words in just a moment because I think between fighting words and incitement, those are the two most relevant forms of non-protected speech that we had with you raids.
And they cross over quite a bit.
And they do. There is a lot of crossover between the two. So we're going to finish out our list of non-protected speech, and the remaining, items of non-protected speech are child pornography.
Right.
Actual true threats, like I am on my way to bomb your house.
Right.
And that person actually is on their way to bomb that person's house. That is not-protected speech. And then the last one is kind of a gray area, right? This is pursuant to United States versus Alvarez. It was a Supreme Court decision in 2012. They also throw in speech presenting some grave and imminent threat to the government that the government has the power to prevent. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but let's go back to fighting words. Okay, so what are fighting words? It's pretty important, right?
It is, and I think that when we talked about this in our pre-show production, is that it's an immediate. It's a by you actually saying the words, you are basically creating an immediate breach of the peace. Like they're called fighting words because it's literally the idea. It's just like you would picture it in your mind. I'm saying this because I'm about to fight you. Like,
and that's important.
I'm trying to bait you into this, and we're going to do this thing.
So there are words said to an individual. So Austin, if I came up to you on the street and I said that you like your cowboy boots, right?
No, yeah, always.
Austin, your cowboy boots are effing disgusting, and I hope they burn. This is a comical example, right? But if Austin was so obsessed with his cowboy boots that incited him to, I knew that would incite him to punch me because he's very protective of his cowboy boots. Okay, those could possibly be considered fighting words, right? That's a comical example. But the point is that fighting words are specifically direct, face-to-face personal insults that would likely lead the recipient to respond with violence.
Right.
And so let's go back, right? So let's go all the way back to 1942 to Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire. And I am sure I am butchering his name. I am so sorry.
That looks right to me. I think you got
Hopefully.
it.
So the Chaplinsky case was a United States in a Supreme Court decision. And basically, long story short, the case involved a Jehovah's Witness named Walter Chaplinsky, who was arrested in Rochester, New Hampshire for breach of the peace for cursing at a local marshal. So basically local law enforcement. Yeah. Okay. So Mr. Chaplinsky is there face-to-face with the marshal, and he's saying all these bad things, and he's basically saying things that would incite the marshal to commit violence against Chaplinsky. And that is the origin of the fighting words carve out from free speech. Yeah.
Well, it's the same idea as like, you know, I tell a lot of people when they have a confrontation with a police officer, even if you're right about what's going on, if you're right that the officer is that doesn't understand the law, that the officer is trying to kind of harass you because they think you're violating the law. Well, if you start hurling insults like Chaplinsky did, you're pushing it too far, probably still going to arrest you. You're probably still going to get charged with something. And it's probably going to be just fine that they did it because you were being an idiot.
Yeah.
It's a paraphrase version, but also you weren't protected by the First Amendment either.
You're not protected by the First Amendment.
Yeah.
So let's go back to another example that on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? So we already said that the speech has to address a particular listener and not the general public. Yeah. And I think that's really important. So I'm going to say it again. Fighting words have to address an individual listener and not the general public.
Yeah.
It's really important. So, for example, famous example, Cohen versus California. There was a anti-Vietnam War protester, and I believe he was actually, I think he was in a courtroom. I can't remember for sure.
He was in a public building for sure.
He was in a public building. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I remember this case.
Yeah. And he had a jacket on, and it had some explicit language on the back of his jacket. So I'm going to say, if you're listening in the car and you have small children and you don't want them hearing the F word, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to turn this off. I'm going to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I hope you turn this off now. Okay. So the jacket said, fuck the draft.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is the Vietnam era. I mean, there are some very strong emotions about the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Okay. But the court ultimately held, right, that at the end of the day, that was protected speech.
And this was one of my favorite First Amendment cases from law school because it really carved out and delineated, okay, that's not directed at an individual. It's not, you're not face to face with somebody. You're not talking to a Vietnam War vet who just got back from the war, and you're not insulting them about their service time in Vietnam. You are protesting what you find is an offensive government procedure. And you're allowed to do that.
And that is protected speech.
It is. Now, the curse word, the obscenity part of it, they didn't get into that. The case primarily focused on whether, the language on that back of the jacket was going to constitute fighting words. And again, just like you were saying, because that jacket he wasn't going up to a Vietnam vet, it wasn't directed at a particular individual. Yep.
It was just directed to the general public. They're not fighting words.
Yeah. And that's, you get to things like you see T-shirts and bumper stickers that say arrest Trump or impeach Obama, those types of things. They're allowed to say that because even though in that point they're directed at an individual, it's the opposite end of the spectrum. They're not fighting words. They're allowed to make some type of an argument about a governmental action.
Yeah.
Now, well, I won't get into another example popped in my head, but that's the idea is that they're trying to allow the Supreme Court is trying to allow the First Amendment to function the way it's supposed to, allow people to talk freely, but you can't let it create violence.
So I have seen a lot of articles and a lot of people basically saying that Trump told the people who attended his Save America rally that was occurring within walking distance of the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, to storm the Capitol, and that he was inciting violence and that he should be charged. Let's break this down.
Break it down.
Let's break it down.
This is the part I was looking forward to.
Okay. So, I like original sources. I was a history and global politics double major in college. I like original sources. So what's the original source here? The script from Trump's speech.
Perfect.
And it was real long, y'all. My dog fell asleep while I was reading it. All right, so let's pick out. So I went through and I picked out the most colorful, I guess, snippets from his speech, or the snippets that various different journalists who were not lawyers were pointing out and saying, oh, this was inciting violence. Okay, well, frankly, I think that they were basically wrong for the most part, but let's understand why, right? Because some of them, there might be an argument.
Right, okay.
There could be an argument, maybe. All right, so first one, Austin, why don't you start reading off the first chunk of speech, starting with Republicans are constantly.
So one of the things that President Trump said, Republicans are constantly fighting like a boxer with his hands tied behind his back. It's like a boxer. And we want to be nice. We want to be so nice. We want to be so respectful of everybody, including bad people. And we're going to have to fight much harder.
Okay. And then a little bit further on in the speech, Trump also says that, you have to show strength. You have to be strong. And he is, for context, addressing a rally of his supporters. Okay, so
and I think one key thing is I think he does say, and this is the part that I think I've seen a lot of people key in on, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And that's part of
he says that pretty often throughout the speech.
Yeah. But that's one of the things that I think people are keying in on. Like he told them to walk down there. He told them to go down and be violent and do those types of things.
But here's the thing. We have the boxer metaphor. We have the phrase, fight much harder. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. You have to show strength. You have to be strong. Okay, well, I see where people are like, oh, he's telling people to be violent. Okay, well, that's, first of all, a logical leap.
Right.
To say, to assume that after using a metaphor, what was clearly a metaphor about a boxer, who, by the way, had his hands tied behind his back.
Right.
So how much damage can a boxer do with no hands? And then he says you have to show strength. Well, strength can mean a lot of things. Strength could mean quiet strength. Strength can mean standing in the rain and picketing. Strength could mean, speaking up for what someone thinks is not right. Strength does not mean I'm going to literally punch your effing face out.
Right.
Okay. So there is a lot of violent imagery in this snippet here. And one reporter was saying, oh, it's so violent. He's telling people to fight harder. This basically is incitement.
Yeah, and I think that you've already insinuated to it and alluded to it. The Supreme Court was very specific about what incitement and fighting words are, as best they can be with the cases they have. And we talked about the limitation with fighting words a second ago. It has to be imminent. It has to be directed at an individual. Well, incitement has to be a direct call to action, so to speak. Another Austin paraphrase. Call to action to go and do something. He's the only thing he's potentially calling to action, and I don't even think he gets there, is we're going to walk down to the Capitol. He doesn't say walk down to the Capitol. That would be much more of a call to action. But the way he phrases it, he's not really calling them to action to go and incite violence.
Right.
And so I think that the Supreme Court hasn't actually come out and said this. At least I've never read the opinions this way, but they haven't come out and said, well, you can't cherry pick different parts of the statement to make it insightful or inciting, excuse me. But that's, to me, the way the analysis probably would go down is they would not say, okay, well, in the first sentence of the second paragraph, he said this. In the fourth sentence of the fifth paragraph, he said this. When you take these two sentences, put them together side by side in text, well, he's inciting violence. Well,
context is key.
Context is key, and it's also, context is the delivery. How was the speech delivered? Obviously, it was very impassioned. We know how President Trump speaks. But I think people are, and look, I didn't agree with what he said, but people trying to make the connection that he was inciting violence, you are making a huge constitutional leap there.
Yeah, because again, let's go back to United States versus Alvarez, right? Incitement, right? The not protected area of speech. It's directed to inducing or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to induce or produce such action.
Right.
Okay, using metaphors about a boxer and saying you need to be strong, and then clumping that with the phrase, we are going to walk down to the Capitol building. What's violent about that?
Yeah. He's actually encouraging people's right to vote, people's right to peacefully assemble, people's right to speak out. First Amendment rights.
Absolutely. So I think we can safely say that it would be extremely unlikely that qualifies as incitement.
Right. Agreed.
So next, Austin, you want to read the fraud portion, starting with when you catch somebody?
Yes. So when you catch somebody, and this is still President Trump, when you catch somebody in fraud, you are allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike, talking about Mike Pence, I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. And I hope he doesn't listen to the rhinos and the stupid people that he's listening to.
Okay, so first of all, for some people who may not know, rhino is a pejorative term that means Republicans in name only.
I actually didn't realize that until this podcast. So
yeah, it's a pretty nasty term. It means what exactly?
For sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
Anyway, and so that's rude, first of all. But being rude is not unconstitutional.
It's not unconstitutional. People do it every day.
And then one reporter was saying the phrase, "You are allowed to go by very different rules," carries tones of permissiveness. And where she was going with that statement was that he was basically extending a permissory, is that how you say it? Permissory? Permissive?
Sure. Permissive.
A permissive tone to the audience that would then go and permit and facilitate violence at the Capitol building.
Being a vigilante of some sort.
Well, that's kind of a leap to
leap.
me. That seems like an awful big leap, right? You know, to say that he hoped that Mr. Pence does the right thing and he hoped that he doesn't listen to these rhinos, as he says, and other people. So at the end of the day, sure. Is the statement rude? Is it belittling? Is it pejorative? Yeah. But, and it also shows a lack of understanding of how fraud works. And we can do a whole series on election fraud because it does not work the way a lot of people think it does.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, but at the end of the day, is Trump advocating violence here or engaging in fighting words?
Not at all. And I think the reporter's own phrasing and analysis of it's carrying tones, again, not direct, carrying tones. It's not implications themselves and implied meanings. They don't get you there for inciting.
Again, for fighting words, too, it has to be a direct face-to-face insult to an individual.
Right.
Again, frankly, I don't... Oh, well, I'll go into that later. All right, next up, starting with I hope Mike.
Yeah, next he's I hope Mike's going to do the right thing. Obviously, we're still talking about Mike Pence here. I hope so. I hope so because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. And I just spoke to Mike. I said, Mike, that doesn't take courage. What takes courage is to do nothing. That takes courage. And you want me to keep going with the next one. I also want to thank our 13 most courageous members of the U.S. Senate, Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Ron Johnson, Senator Josh Hawley. Senators have stepped up. We want to thank them. I actually think, though, it takes, again, more courage not to step up. And I think a lot of those people are going to find that out. And you better start looking at your leadership because your leadership has led you down the tubes.
Okay. So a reporter saw this and she said that, oh my gosh, President Trump is engaging in language that has implications that those who are not going along with the Trump were putting themselves at risk. At risk for what? She didn't say. And she made a very, very big point as saying, as I understand it, at around this time in the speech, the crowd was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Yeah. Okay, that was the crowd chanting, not President Trump saying that. Right. To my understanding, he didn't say that at all. At this, he just didn't say it. So again, is this language rude and demeaning? Sure. Yeah. Is it in poor taste? Sure. Does it show a lack of understanding of our basic electoral process? Sure, but then he has that in common with most Americans.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
But is he advocating violence or fighting words?
He's not.
Okay.
So we're not there.
We're not there.
Still protected.
Still protected. Carry on.
And then he follows up, we will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore. And that is what this is all about. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal. You will have an illegitimate president. That is what you will have. And we can't let that happen. These are the facts that you won't hear from the fake news media. It's all part of the suppression effort. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. We will fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
All right. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So the reporter said that this was an implicit request for more than just peaceful protest, namely violence to stop Biden from being president. But, Austin, to me, this section does not say that.
It doesn't. And it, again, look, and if this isn't clear, I'm not a Trump fan. I support the office, but, I'm not a Trump fan. But none of what he said in any of this has violated the First Amendment. He's allowed to say these things. He's allowed to implore, have an impassioned speech. That's part of the beauty of the First Amendment, is that he can do these things. He can talk as much trash as he wants to about anybody in office, as long as he's not making false statements of fact, and as long as he's not inciting riots. And just because he's saying we can't let this happen, you got to fight like hell. Well, he didn't say go fight President Biden or fight the Capitol Police.
He's not saying, hey, you know, Lucy in the front row in the Make America Great Again hat, I want you to walk down to the Capitol building and assault federal police officers, push through the barricades, and kidnap Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah.
You know, he's not saying that.
Because that would not only be inciting, but it also that's speech that is that's criminal in nature. So that would be carve-outs that would not be protected.
So that would not be protected in any sense. Here, again, if you don't fight like hell. He's using impassioned language. He's addressing a crowd. He's not advocating any specific forms of violence. And he's not speaking to an individual in a manner so as to incite the individual to physically fight back. Protected.
Right. And quite honestly, you got to believe that his speechwriters were pretty cognizant of this.
Oh, I am sure he's got a team of lawyers.
Yeah.
And I don't know how well he stays on speech, but
right.
I question that sometimes.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure his lawyers are in the back, like, just, please get back on script. We're about 6 words away from a problem here.
Yeah, I would absolutely think so. All right, so we have another. I do want to point out, right? So not all of this. I think Trump, or at least his speechwriters, definitely wanted to make sure that Trump advocated peaceful protest, because in his speech, Trump does say that, quote, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Yeah.
And that's just peaceful protest 101.
He's allowed to say it.
100% protected by the First Amendment. And then the last section, you want to read that?
Sure. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol. We're going to try and give, the Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything, not even one vote, because we are going to try give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Okay. And so the reporter's big takeaway here was that she was essentially saying Trump gave the false impression that he would walk with the protesters to Pennsylvania Avenue. That has nothing to do with the First Amendment.
It don't really matter. Yeah. Doesn't matter at all.
Whatever.
Doesn't matter at all. And, his statements were there. And then, Rudy Giuliani made some pretty brash statements as well. That
I did not read his speech.
So his was a little bit closer to direct action, to fight against the powers that be. Again, if you go back, as our listeners, you go back and look at what he said, it was very similar to President Trump. It was very general. It was a lot of figures of speech. And that's the thing, like, fight like hell. Like, that's a figure of speech. People say it all the time. It's in music. You hear it in sports.
Sure.
You hear it in motivational speeches. And so
I'm sure Tony Robinson has said that at some point.
Probably. And so with those types of things, I mean, again, the key component I think that everybody needs to take away from the exceptions, because the big ones here are the incitement and the fighting words. It's got to be direct. It's got to be concrete. It's got to be very clear that you are directing those comments at somebody or to take a certain action that is violent and a breach of the peace.
Because at the end of the day, the First Amendment is extremely broadly construed and a lot of speech is protected. Now, not wholesale, but putting a restriction on the content of speech is going to be reviewed under the strictest of judicial scrutiny.
Yeah.
And so while the government can, how shall we say, put forth regulations in the manner in which speech is engaged in, right? Like, for example, on a previous episode, you gave the example at Texas Tech, right, where
there were free speech area.
You have free speech area.
Yeah.
You can protest all you want, but you can't protest outside a classroom and block students from entering the classroom.
Right.
So that's not talking about the content. It's just saying the manner.
Yeah.
We're regulating the manner.
Right.
Okay. But content, now, restrictions on content are very strictly regulated, and those are under very strict judicial scrutiny. And
just to make that clear for everybody, what you're saying is that if you have a restriction on what is being said, that's going to be looked at with a microscope and be kind of construed with a fine-tooth comb as to whether you can uphold that restriction. Because that's the whole point of the First Amendment, is that we may not like what you're saying, as long as you don't say it in a violent manner, one exception, then you can say whatever you want, like the Nazis marching
in
through the Jewish neighborhood. Yeah. And so that's the idea, is that if you're going to restrict what I can say, you better have a darn good reason for it.
Yeah. So, Austin, any final words, thoughts, feelings?
For me, again, I think that I've been very open. We've been both been very open about our views and everything. I think that one of the great things about the First Amendment is that it applies across the board to everybody, regardless of what your viewpoint is. Supreme Court, obviously there's conservative and liberal justices on the Supreme Court, but they try to do the best job they can to apply the law across the board. I think as lawyers, we try to do our best to do that. I think on this show, for the integrity of it. I mean, I've said over and over again, I'm not a President Trump fan, but I think everything he did was perfectly within his right. And I hope that as we continue to talk about different type of polarizing issues, that we can, I know we will, but I want our listeners to kind of see we're going to maintain the integrity of this show and make sure that we are talking about things and being open about our viewpoints, but at the same time, not being overly critical just because we have an opposing viewpoint of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, for example, I think that a lot of Trump's speech, he shows a lack of understanding for how the electoral process works and how the basic concept of fraud. I don't think he understands those, or at least if he does, he's certainly not articulating them in a well thought out manner. He's also not a lawyer, right? But I also want people to understand, like, you don't have to be a lawyer to understand the basic concepts of fraud or the basic concepts of what speech is protected and what isn't. Those are your rights to understand what that is. And I want people to take away from this show an understanding of that, so they can have good conversations at home with maybe some of their family members who are very pro-Trump or very pro-Biden, and they can say, hey, yeah, this speech wasn't the best, most well written or well articulated. I'm sure speechwriters put together a lovely speech that maybe he strayed from. But there was nothing illegal about it. There was nothing wrong. And let's get into a good conversation about the merits and the ideals and what is the political situation moving forward. What are things that should be voting on? What should we petition to have put on our local or municipal ballots in the upcoming election season? We want them to have constructive conversations because they have an understanding of what speech is permitted and, what fraud is.
Absolutely.
So, well, ladies and gentlemen, First Amendment 101, free speech.
Guys, thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking with us to this two-part episode. And it'll be interesting again to see how this unfolds over time, because there's going to be a lot of viewpoints that come out.
Absolutely.
Some of them will be educated, some will be uneducated. Hopefully we provided some information to y'all that you can take with you and be able to decipher which ones are of each category.
Absolutely. And stay tuned for closing arguments, y'all. We'll see you next time.
Thank you guys again for listening to us here on #Lawyered. Go find us on whatever platform it is that you listen to your podcast. Go like the podcast, go follow and subscribe to us. Leave us a review, leave us a rating. That helps us to really get the word out and really continue to tell you guys about all the different things that are going on in law and business here in Dallas. Make sure you check out our videos on our YouTube channel. It's #Lawyered. And then also follow us on our Instagram account. It's at #Lawyered. DM us, send us some issues, some topics you'd like to discuss, or some things that maybe you just don't understand about the law, because we want to make sure and cover and give you what it is you want to listen to.
TikTok, everyone. At it again, Ava Louise, a YouTube beauty guru, has been spreading these very colorful rumors that Kanye West was cheating on his wifey Kim Kardashian with Jeffree Star. Mama Bear Kris Jenner was upset, sent a cease and desist letter to the YouTuber saying that if she didn't back down, there might be legal action in the works. Now, Ava Louise did back down, said that, yep, it's all make-believe, but at the end of the day, can Kris Jenner really sue for defamation when the rumors were about Kanye and Kim? The answer is no, probably not. Kris doesn't have standing to sue because the alleged defamation wasn't about her. Bye, y'all.